What's up, y'all? It's your boy Melanated Mastery, Melanated Scholar, road to reading 1,000 books. Um, the other day, maybe about 2 days ago, I just got through reading The Story of the Moors in Spain by Stanley-Lane Poole. And also is republished by John G. Jackson. All right, great book. It talks about obviously the Moors of Spain, right? But in the introduction, it gives a brief summary of how the Moors came from Africa, or quote unquote Africa, and sailed over to Spain under the command of Mansa Musa, sent his two generals. One of them was named General Tarif, and the other one, I believe, was named General Tarim. They were two very prominent Moorish generals at the time. They sailed over to Spain. General Tarif is actually where you get the word tariff from, like tariffs on the highways or tolls and stuff like that. Is because when General Tarif, the Moorish General Tarif, used to go to different places and civilize different places and conquer different places, he used to make the people pay tribute, whether that be gold, women, things like that. So he used to set up tariffs, what they call tariffs, where people would have to pay basically homage to him, tribute to him. But General Tarif went to Spain. He civilized the people of Spain, what we call today Europeans, Asians, Caucasians, whatever term that they want to describe themselves with. Mamluks, that's what they were called back then. It was Mamluks or Mamluks. But yeah, at the beginning they talk about the Moors going over there, civilizing Spain. After Spain was civilized, they actually set up, I believe it was about 8 to 16 universities in Spain, which they still use today. And a lot of these universities, it has pictures in this book, but a lot of these universities actually look like, castles. It's pretty cool. You could tell there was a lot of Arabic influence, Moorish influence, just by the designs. So when they civilized Spain, they ended up, the Sultan and this is where you start heading from, General Tarif and them. This is where you start heading into the Umayyad dynasty, where you get Abdi ar-Rahman, which is another great prominent Moorish military strategist. Not only military strategist, but Abdi ar-Rahman was the first Sultan of Spain, or not Spain, but Cordoba more specifically. So he was his first Sultan of Cordoba. Actually, before him, the Moors set up treaties so that they could import, I believe it's like over 40,000 books into Spain, so that they could go to the universities that they had set up there. So then you have the Sultan Abdi ar-Rahman. He comes in, he not civilizes, but he takes control. He conquers surrounding territories. Now this battle isn't spoke about much in this book, but in another book that I want to mention is called The Dark Ages by Martin J. Doherty. It's a European author, but he actually talks about Abdi ar-Rahman and how one of the sons of the Merovingian dynasty, his name was Charles Martel, actually successfully defended Europe at one point in time from Abdi ar-Rahman and the Moors, in which his book he just calls them Muslims. He wouldn't. Europeans typically don't have a way of talking about Moors directly. So normally in European books, you'll see Moors referred to as Muslims or like Arabs, very broad terms. But yeah, in his book, it talks about it. In this book, it talks a little about how Charles Martel of the Merovingian dynasty led the Franks, which is where we get France from. The name France from the Franks. They were a very uh, dominant army at that time. He successfully defended Europe from Abd al-Rahman until eventually the Muslims just took over, civilized. But yeah, and then you get into his sons. So you have Abd al-Rahman the first, the second, the third, and after the third, he had a son, and his name was, I believe, it was either Harif or it was Hakim. It was one of the two. But there, this book talks about how that guy, that Moor, he actually was famous for having a lot of books because he would get his the people that served him to go around and collect books from different cultures, other Moorish cultures, as well as uh, prominent Caucasian men at the time as well that were taught by the Moors. He would go around and get his Moors to collect these books from them, whether they be in different languages. They would bring it back to him, and he would translate it to Arabic, and then he would then read the books. So it was said in this book that he actually got up to 400,000 books. Not only did he get up to 400,000 books, that he was said to have read over 400,000 books. And now this Hakim or Harif, this Moorish Harif or Hakim, that was the that was ruling over Spain at one point. He actually wasn't like his fathers in the sense that he didn't go to war a lot. He didn't really have that ego to want to go to war and conquer as much. He was more of a noble. He wanted to read. He wanted to learn. He wanted to unlock the keys to life. He wanted to figure things out and discover new things. He was all about learning and elevating his mind. So he got these books, and it was said also. This book talks about and by the way, Stanley-Lane Poole was actually I believe he was a British European. Um, Obviously came from Britain, right? But he actually wrote this in the 1800s. I believe it's like the 1840s, the late 1800s, sometime around that. He actually has a few other books that I have to read as well. But going back to Hakim or Harif, the Moorish ruler of Spain, he was said to actually, whenever he did go to war, he was said to go to war with like hundreds of books by his side. I mean, that's how dedicated he was to read books and to knowledge. He was, I mean, from reading this book, it seemed like he was pretty enlightened as far as his knowledge of what was going on around him, to the point where whenever he did have to go to war, he would go with books. I mean, that just says a lot about somebody. I mean, that's something I would do, to be honest. Because knowledge is power, really. The application of knowledge is power. And obviously he was a believer of that. So yeah, this book talks about how some of the Moors used to go to war with books. Obviously it talks about the golden age of Islam, which I personally believe that they renamed it the golden age of Islam rather than the golden age of the Moors, because most of the inventors in the golden age was Moors. At this time in Europe, not only in Europe, everywhere across the globe, I believe, darker melanated people, today called Black people, were the majority everywhere. I mean, and we still are today, but definitely back then, the majority was ruled. We were ruling by the majority of melanated Moors. So they had to rename it, instead of the golden age of the Moor, they had to obviously rename it to the golden age of Islam, in which they could, and they being Europeans Europeans and Asians, Caucasians could rename, or not rename, but whitewash a lot of the pictures. So now when you speak of Berbers, so that's another thing too. When you talk about Moors is a broad term for darker people that were ruling back then. The darker colored people, right? Melanated people. That was a broad term to describe melanated people. even the word Moor comes from the Greek word moros, which means, dark or like, black. But you had different types of Moors as well. So just like you got quote unquote black people today, you have and you have differences in black people. Like you might have some Dominican, and you might have some, Nigerian, or Saudi Arabian, or whatever those distinctions. It was the same way back then. So they were called Moors, but you had on one end Berbers, you had Saracens, you had Libyans, you had Phoenicians, you had, Thebans, Thinites, Cushites, Memphites. You had all these different types of Moors. So I think what a lot of people have to understand is that the Moors were describing darker people, but not only were they describing darker people, that we need to understand as well that there were different types of Moors and different culture groups within the broad term of being a Moor, right? So this book talks about all of that. To sum a lot of it up, this book is very wordy as far as vocabulary goes. So whatever words you don't know, I would suggest looking up. But this book is basically a book of the wars between the Moors. And by reading this book, you come to realize that one of the biggest problems was that we would go to war with each other all the time. I believe I talked about this when I did the book review on Destruction of the Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams, which he was explaining the same thing, is that you have these books that explains these great wars that we used to have with each other. And you get to learn from our mistakes in the past, so to speak, that being disunified only leads us to our downfall. And going to war with each other only leads to our ultimate demise, so to speak, right? So this book basically gives you a brief history of some of the most famous Moorish wars that went on. Another thing toward the end that this book talked about as well, in the last, maybe 50 to 75 pages of the book, it explains how when Europeans became when Europeans started to conquer Moors, obviously through things like the Inquisition and things like that, what a strategy is that they denationalize us. So when they would come and conquer Moorish territories, they would force Moors by sword to convert to Christianity, take on a Christian name like, John, Samuel, Christian names, right? So they slowly began to become denationalized. So now you go from being a Moor to terms like a Black Moor, and then you go from being like terms like a Black Moor to terms like, Moriscos. Now, from Moor to Moriscos, that's when you get the Moors converting from Islam to Christianity. So now you have Moriscos, which is Moors that converted to Christianity and were started to serve Europeans in their armies. And then, obviously from Moriscos, you go to later down the line, you go to things like Negroes. And then from Negroes, you go to obviously, Blacks, Black. And then from Black, you go to, African American, just broader and broader terms. So you have no idea of your lineage and where you actually came from. As far as a nation, right? Because if you're known as a Moor, then that ties you to a lot of Moorish nations that we had back then versus, you being called Black, and, there's no nation that's tied to Black, there's no nation that's tied to African American, as it's too broad of a term. Where at in Africa? You're African American. Where in Africa are you from to have come to America? Which, a lot of that, this book doesn't really talk about that, but a lot of that, at least I believe from my research, that a lot of us are Aboriginal to America, and that this whole we come from Africa and we come from Africa and that we went other places. I actually gravitate towards us, not only the great possibility of us starting in America, but us coming from all types of places, whether that be the Americas, the Africas, the Antarctica, whether it be any continent. I believe that we had different walks of life from every place at one point in time, and that it didn't necessarily come from or start from Africa. Um, yeah, but that's a whole nother ball game. This book is a very, very great book. I put it up there with Chancellor Williams' book, Destruction of Black Civilization. If you want to know about the Moors, you know, about the great things we did in Spain and Europe, and then I would uh, get this book. And I was actually checking up book reviews on this book because I really haven't seen any. And I finally like found one, and I believe it was from a guy from India or whatever. And you notice that when when other people who don't claim to be like African American or black, they claim to be like Indian or European or white or whatever. You see, when they read books like this about history, they will never get a book with a black person on it or a darker person on it. They will never get a book. Like this one guy that was doing the book review, he had I've never seen the cover before, but he had the book where the cover was like it looked like a flower kind of, but I believe it was like it was one of the architectural designs of what the Moors used back then. But he he had that instead of having this right here, right? And not only did he have that, but when he was giving his book review on the Moors and stuff like that, I mean, he was throwing up so many like white faces up there. It was just like, it was crazy to see. I find it a bit disrespectful when you see people talk about ancient people and they act like that they weren't darker or that they're too prideful to give um, credit to people who helped them. So that's just one of the things that I noticed. It's like this guy is up here throwing up Caucasian pictures of Berbers and Caucasian pictures of Saracens and stuff like that. And I was just like, man. But I definitely believe that we're heading toward a greater time. I definitely believe that more should be reading this book. Definitely recommend it. But that's my book review on The Moors in Spain by Stanley-Lane Poole. I should have a few more coming from his books. So it's your boy Melanated Mastery, Road to Reading 1,000 Books. I'll catch y'all next one.